In a wide-ranging television interview that touched on some of the most contentious issues facing the Department of Justice today, Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche sat down to address mounting questions about the release of millions of pages of documents related to the late financier Jeffrey Epstein, the controversial arrest of two high-profile journalists at a Minnesota church, and an ongoing federal investigation into election materials from Georgia's 2020 presidential contest. The conversation, marked by pointed exchanges and careful legal parsing, offered a rare window into how the current administration is navigating the intersection of press freedom, religious liberty, election integrity, and public accountability. What emerged was not just a defense of recent Justice Department actions, but a broader statement about the priorities and philosophy guiding federal law enforcement at this critical moment in American political history. As controversy swirls around each of these cases, with critics charging political motivation and defenders insisting on equal application of the law, the Deputy Attorney General's remarks provide crucial insight into the government's position and the legal framework supporting these high-stakes decisions. The interview centered on three major developments that have dominated headlines and sparked intense debate across the political spectrum. First, the Justice Department's July release of more than 3.5 million pages of documents related to Jeffrey Epstein's criminal activities and associates following congressional mandate and presidential directive. Second, the federal indictment of former CNN anchor Don Lemon and journalist Georgia Fort on charges they violated federal law during a protest at a Minnesota church, despite initial rejection of arrest warrants by a conservative federal judge. Third, the execution of a federal search warrant by FBI agents at the Fulton County, Georgia Elections Office to seize materials related to the 2020 presidential election, including ballots, voter rolls, and scanner images. Each of these matters raises fundamental questions about federal authority, constitutional rights, and the proper balance between competing interests in a democratic society. The discussion began with the Epstein files, a subject that has captured public attention since the disgraced financier's death in federal custody and the subsequent arrest and conviction of his associate Ghislaine Maxwell. Deputy Attorney General Blanche addressed pointed criticism from entrepreneur Elon Musk, who is mentioned in some of the released documents and who wrote on social media that what matters is not the release of files, but rather the prosecution of those who committed crimes with Epstein. Musk stated that only when there is at least one arrest will some justice have been done, characterizing anything less as performative distraction. Blanche firmly rejected this characterization, explaining that the Justice Department conducted a thorough review of the files before their release and determined there was insufficient evidence to prosecute additional individuals beyond those already charged. He emphasized that the department was ordered to release the documents both by Congress and by the President, and that the entire world now has access to these materials and can evaluate whether the Justice Department made the correct determination. Furthermore, Blanche sought to separate the question of prosecutions arising from the Epstein files from the broader work the Justice Department is conducting in the area of protecting children and prosecuting sex trafficking. He stated emphatically that this Justice Department, working alongside the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security, has pursued more sex traffickers, more child pornographers, and more individuals who have harmed children and young women than any administration in history. This assertion positions the current administration as aggressive on these issues, even as questions persist about whether additional prosecutions related to Epstein himself will materialize. The Deputy Attorney General's comments suggest that while the Epstein matter may not yield new charges, the department views its record on related crimes as exceptionally strong. Among the newly released files is a list compiled by the FBI as recently as August containing numerous salacious, though explicitly unverified, allegations about President Trump. When questioned about why the FBI created this list and whether all claims had been investigated, Blanche clarified that the document was not specifically about President Trump, but rather concerned multiple individuals mentioned in the Epstein files. He explained that the released materials reveal hundreds of calls made to the FBI containing allegations from either anonymous sources or individuals who were quickly determined to lack credibility, either because of the nature of their claims or their failure to provide information or corroboration. This explanation offers insight into the challenge federal investigators face when dealing with high-profile cases that generate numerous tips of varying quality and reliability. The conversation then shifted to what has become perhaps the most controversial action discussed in the interview, the arrest of former CNN anchor Don Lemon and journalist Georgia Fort on federal charges stemming from their participation in a protest at a Minnesota church. The case has sparked fierce debate about the boundaries of press freedom and the proper application of federal law protecting religious worship. A conservative federal judge, identified as someone who clerked for the late Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, had previously rejected the requested arrest warrants, writing that there was no evidence the two journalists engaged in criminal behavior or conspired to do so. An appeals court upheld that decision, yet the Justice Department subsequently brought the case before a grand jury which returned an indictment. Deputy Attorney General Blanche defended this sequence of events by clarifying what he described as a mischaracterization of the appeals court's ruling. While acknowledging that one judge on the appeals court had agreed there was no probable cause, Blanche pointed to another judge on that same court who stated there was clearly probable cause that a crime had been committed. More fundamentally, he explained that the American legal system does not allow judges alone to make the final determination on whether charges should be brought in such cases. Judges can authorize arrest warrants based on complaints, but only a grand jury composed of ordinary citizens can return an indictment. In this instance, 25 citizens from Minneapolis and the surrounding area reviewed the evidence and determined that probable cause existed to charge Lemon and Fort. The indictment contains 29 alleged overt acts of conspiracy, and the interviewer focused on two specific allegations that raise First Amendment concerns. Overt Act number 20 states that defendant Lemon told his live stream audience about congregants leaving the church and about a young man who Lemon observed was frightened, scared, and crying, and that Lemon noted the reactions were understandable because the experience was traumatic and uncomfortable, which he said was the purpose. Overt Act number 21 alleges that as the operation continued, Lemon expressed surprise that police had not yet arrived and admitted knowing that the whole point was to disrupt the church service. The interviewer pressed on why a jury would not view this simply as a journalist observing and reporting events, activity clearly protected by the First Amendment. Blanche responded by arguing that the interviewer had selectively quoted from the indictment while leaving out multiple other allegations about Lemon's conduct. According to the Deputy Attorney General, the charging document details how Lemon surreptitiously avoided revealing where the protesters were going, participated in planning sessions, and was part of decisions to ensure that police and federal law enforcement did not learn of the protest in advance. Blanche characterized these actions as going well beyond typical journalistic activity, stating that legitimate journalists would never engage in such conduct. He acknowledged that Lemon has the right to mount a defense, and if his legal strategy is to claim he was merely acting as a journalist, he is free to do so. However, the government's position is that the full scope of his actions, as detailed in the indictment, demonstrates conduct that crosses the line from protected journalism into criminal conspiracy. The interviewer pushed back on this characterization, noting that there are countless examples of reporters being embedded with military units or other groups where they are instructed not to reveal locations or plans. Similarly, journalists routinely receive embargoed information from government agencies, including the Justice Department itself, and agree to withhold reporting until given permission to publish. These practices, the interviewer argued, are not unusual and are not fundamentally different from what Lemon and Fort did in this situation. This exchange highlights the central tension in the case, whether the journalist's participation in and knowledge of the protest plan constituted criminal conspiracy or fell within the bounds of legitimate news gathering. Deputy Attorney General Blanche acknowledged that embargoed information and restrictions on reporting locations are indeed common and have existed for decades. However, he maintained that anyone who watches the publicly available live stream that Lemon broadcast and listens to the comments he made would recognize that this case involves different considerations. He framed the issue as one of balance, asking how society should weigh the FACE Act, which protects religious worship, against freedom of the press. He described children crying and screaming, parents searching for their children, and families simply trying to attend a Sunday morning church service. Blanche stated that he and the Justice Department believe no one watching the full context of what occurred that day could honestly conclude the journalist's actions were appropriate or protected. When asked whether the prosecution was truly about the conduct at the church or about making an example of someone with whom the president has sparred, Blanche insisted the department is not making examples of anyone. He stated he does not even know whether President Trump has ever thought about Don Lemon, though he acknowledged he could not be certain. What he could confirm, however, was that the Attorney General flew to Minneapolis the day after the incident and remained there for 3 days to assess what had occurred. According to Blanche, there is no scenario under which the American people would view the disruption of that church service as acceptable. This response attempts to ground the prosecution in the specific facts of what happened rather than any political vendetta. The interviewer noted, however, that the White House official social media account celebrated Lemon's arrest with a post about the media and a chain emoji, making clear that the White House was very much aware of the case. When Blanche attempted to clarify that awareness is different from having a vendetta, the interviewer revealed that President Trump had called Lemon a sleazebag just the day before after his arrest. This exchange underscores the political dimension that inevitably surrounds high-profile prosecutions, particularly when they involve media figures who have been critical of the administration. The interview's final segment addressed the FBI's execution of a search warrant at the Elections Office in Fulton County, Georgia, to seize materials from the 2020 presidential election, including ballots, voter rolls, and scanner images. President Trump told reporters following the search that agents had gotten into the votes and that people would see some interesting things happening. When asked what interesting things the president was referring to and why he appeared so involved in an FBI and Justice Department operation, Blanche drew a distinction between the president making a comment and the president being involved in the investigation itself. He stated he does not believe the president was involved in the operational aspects of the case. The Deputy Attorney General explained that a federal magistrate judge in Atlanta authorized the search warrant as part of an ongoing criminal grand jury investigation. The records have been seized by the FBI and the investigation continues. He emphasized that the matter is tightly held, as criminal grand jury investigations must be under federal law, and declined to provide specifics about what is being investigated. When pressed about why the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, was present during what the interviewer characterized as an FBI raid, Blanche corrected the terminology, describing it instead as FBI agents executing a search warrant in the middle of the day. He stated he did not know specifically why Director Gabbard was present, but noted that she is not part of the grand jury investigation itself. However, he explained that she plays a key role in the administration's election integrity efforts and is an expert in that area, with her team focusing significantly on ensuring free and fair elections. The interviewer noted that claims of voter fraud in Georgia related to the 2020 election have been debunked repeatedly through multiple recounts and investigations. This observation raises questions about the basis for the current federal investigation and whether it represents a continuation of efforts to challenge results that have been certified and affirmed through numerous official processes. Deputy Attorney General Blanche declined to address the specific focus of the investigation, but reiterated that election integrity is of the highest importance to the American people and should matter to citizens regardless of their political affiliation. He stated that the Justice Department is doing everything possible to ensure the country has free and fair elections. To understand the significance of these developments, it is essential to consider the historical context in which they are occurring. The Justice Department has long grappled with questions about its independence from political influence, particularly when investigations touch on matters of interest to the sitting president or involve politically prominent figures. From the Watergate scandal that brought down the Nixon presidency to the various independent counsel investigations of the Clinton administration, from the controversy surrounding the firing of United States attorneys during the George W. Bush administration to debates about the Russia investigation during the Trump administration, the proper role of the Justice Department in American democracy has been repeatedly tested and refined. The current cases involving journalists, election materials, and high-profile document releases occur against this historical backdrop and will be evaluated in part by how they compare to these precedents. The individuals at the center of these controversies bring their own complex backgrounds to the story. Todd Blanche, the Deputy Attorney General, previously served as a defense attorney and notably represented President Trump in some of his legal matters before joining the administration. This professional history has led critics to question whether he can maintain the independence traditionally expected of Justice Department leadership. Don Lemon, the arrested journalist, spent years as a prominent CNN anchor before his departure from the network and subsequently launched independent media ventures. His often contentious relationship with conservative political figures and his willingness to cover controversial protests have made him a polarizing figure in American media. Georgia Fort, the other arrested journalist, has built a reputation for covering protests and social justice movements. Tulsi Gabbard, now serving as Director of National Intelligence, is a former Democratic congresswoman from Hawaii who became an increasingly vocal critic of her party before leaving and ultimately aligning with President Trump. Her presence at the Georgia search raises questions about the traditional boundaries between intelligence agencies and domestic law enforcement. The implications of these cases extend across multiple dimensions of American life. Politically, the prosecutions and investigations are likely to deepen partisan divisions, with Republicans largely supporting aggressive action on election integrity and Epstein-related matters, while Democrats express alarm about what they characterize as politically motivated prosecutions of journalists and continued attempts to undermine confidence in the 2020 election results. The cases may influence how the press covers the administration going forward, potentially creating a chilling effect if journalists fear that certain types of protest coverage could expose them to federal charges. Legally, the Lemon and Fort prosecution will test the boundaries of the FACE Act, the federal law protecting religious worship spaces, and its interaction with First Amendment press freedoms. Courts will need to determine where the line falls between journalism and criminal conspiracy when reporters embed themselves with protest movements. Socially, these matters touch on fundamental questions about religious liberty, press freedom, and trust in democratic institutions. They occur at a moment when polling consistently shows declining confidence in both media organizations and government institutions, and the outcomes may either restore or further erode that confidence depending on how the cases proceed and how they are perceived by different segments of the population. Political analysts and legal experts across the ideological spectrum have begun weighing in on these developments, though their assessments vary dramatically based on their prior perspectives and political orientations. Some constitutional scholars have expressed serious concerns about the prosecution of journalists for their conduct during a protest, arguing that the charges represent a dangerous precedent that could discourage aggressive investigative journalism and protest coverage. Others maintain that no one, including journalists, is above the law, and if Lemon and Fort conspired to violate federal statutes protecting religious worship, they should face the same accountability as anyone else. Regarding the Georgia investigation, election law experts note that while concerns about election security and integrity are legitimate, the specific focus on materials from an election that has been repeatedly audited and certified raises questions about the investigation's true purpose. Public reaction, as reflected in social media discourse and early polling, appears highly polarized along familiar partisan lines, with Republicans expressing support for the Justice Department's actions and Democrats viewing them as confirmation of fears about the weaponization of federal law enforcement. In the coming days and weeks, several key developments will merit close attention. The criminal case against Don Lemon and Georgia Fort will proceed through the federal court system, with pretrial motions likely to focus heavily on First Amendment defenses and the scope of permissible journalistic activity. Courts will need to determine whether the case can proceed to trial or whether constitutional protections require its dismissal. The Georgia grand jury investigation will continue, presumably leading either to indictments if investigators believe they have uncovered criminal conduct or to a conclusion with no charges if the evidence does not support prosecution. The political reaction to all of these matters will play out in Congress, where members of both parties will use oversight hearings and public statements to advance their competing narratives about Justice Department independence and proper enforcement priorities. The broader question of election integrity and how it will factor into upcoming electoral contests remains open, with these investigations likely to feature prominently in political messaging from all sides. These interconnected controversies represent far more than isolated legal matters or routine law enforcement actions. They sit at the nexus of fundamental questions about American democracy, the rule of law, press freedom, religious liberty, and the proper exercise of federal power. How they are resolved, both in courtrooms and in the court of public opinion, will have lasting implications for the relationship between media and government, the scope of protected journalistic activity, and public confidence in federal institutions. The Deputy Attorney General's defense of the Justice Department's actions reflects a view that the law is being applied equally and without regard to politics based on evidence and legal standards. Critics see a different picture, one in which federal law enforcement has been deployed against political opponents and critical journalists while pursuing investigations into election matters that have already been thoroughly examined. As these cases move forward, Americans will be watching to see which narrative proves more accurate and what precedents are established for future administrations and future conflicts between competing constitutional values. The answers to these questions will help define not just this moment in American political history, but the boundaries and norms that will govern federal law enforcement and press freedom for years to come.